Hello, audience. My name is Daniel Yates, and let's see if we can keep this up a little better. And so we are here today with Bruce Maxwell. Did I say that correctly?
Bryce
Maxwell. I'm terrible with names.
And no W in the last name, just Maxwell.
Maxwell.
Yep.
Maxwell, okay. And you are from what organization?
The Montana Natural Heritage Program. I'm the program coordinator here, and we manage statewide databases on animals and plants and habitats across Montana, so that all that information can be used to inform environmental review, permitting, or planning processes, and also just for the enjoyment of Montana's citizens.
Cool. Yeah. God, I'm so bad with names. We had the Montana Fish and Wildlife because they don't have their own state herpetologist. I was told that you guys took care of that.
We do. We've done statewide inventories for all of the amphibians and reptiles in the state, and doing more effort these days on bats, but because of white nose syndrome. But in the past, we've done pond surveys for all of the pond breeding amphibians. We've done stream surveys for the stream breeders, rock outcrop surveys for reptiles, across the entire state. So we've got some good baseline data for most of the amphibian and reptile species in Montana.
Cool. See, I was wondering, how do you guys do your studies and stuff?
So basically I go back up a little bit and say our program is, here to kind of understand the distribution and status of all the animals and plants and habitats in the state. And then we let agencies know, we provide them access to all that information, and natural resource managers in both the state, federal, private, local government agencies, tribal as well, and then private organizations can request information from us as well. So we're all, kind of one common set of data that everybody can come to and answer questions on that common set of data. And then for individual taxa, we just go and follow standardized protocols. For amphibians, it's sort of timed searches of water bodies for pond breeding amphibians, using both your visual encounter as well as dip netting around the shoreline, those shallow water habitats. For stream breeding amphibians, electrofishing is a common technique used for tailed frogs and Idaho giant salamanders. And for reptiles, visual encounter surveys around rock outcrops is a common, you're sort of turning over cover objects in those areas, looking for reptiles underneath cover objects. So those are just a few standard protocols. Another actually very common standard protocol that's used is amphibian calling surveys. So you're trying to drive around during wet weather and just listening for calls of breeding choruses, right after rainfall. So that's a very common one to look at changes in distribution over time for calling amphibians.
Yeah, I had the Missouri State herpetologist on at one point in time, Jeff Brigler, wonderful guy, actually back from the 70s and stuff, and they told him he'd never be able to find hellbenders. The reason why I'm bringing this up is because of the hellbenders as a species that is not well protected, even though they are they need to be. They're kind of endangered in some ways. And so what he did was, they told him back in the 70s he'd never be able to find them, like the nests. He says he now finds about 15 a year. Now, I did not ask him how, because I don't want the public out there looking. Because I noticed when you were talking about turning over rocks and stuff, it's like, when we go, we're talking to some of the herpetologists and stuff, it's like, you got to be very careful about that. That's what I liked about Utah's their tests that you have to take to collect anything from the wild. And they talk about any rock that you flip over, you need to put back, but you need to be that extra special careful, not just so you don't get bit by a rattlesnake, but also the fact that they don't want you to kill the local wildlife. So these are things that we need to think about when we do these studies. And so how can people...
Absolutely. You immediately brought to mind a study that was done in Australia by some herpetologists there about changing those cover objects. And if you don't put them back in exactly the same place, the animals don't look at it as if it's the same habitat, and essentially you've destroyed the habitat for them. And so that can be you really have to be cautious about putting back the cover objects in the same way that they were there in the first place.
Yeah, I'm going to do some episode on some neuroscience stuff with reptiles. And I've got a bearded dragon episode on the nonverbals. And I explained that these guys actually remember in 3D. They actually, reptiles as a general, I have an episode on that too. Reptiles think in mapping their territories. There's actually studies done. And I've got an emerald skink that would play, and he was mapping his territory, and you could see that one of my bearded dragons, she would move around and she would lose her way, even though she's seen it before, and she's my smart beardy. It's the same thing as humans, as when they have such limited space in their brains. So when you have a checklist of things you want to do, and then you walk into another room and you completely forget the checklist, it's because your brain did not store that in any long-term memory. You stored it in your short-term, and then you went into another room, into another environment, and then it just automatically went away because your brain just didn't store it. And so your brain's like, no, click over to this because we need to be prepared for something else. Imagine having less space than a human mind. And that's what a reptile does. That's something that we could see. And this is why I like getting into these conversations, because it is you could flip over a rock, but this is also why changing up their enclosures by moving stuff around is actually beneficial for one in captivity, so that they feel like it's a new territory. It gets their brains moving. Whereas one in the wild, you may not want that because they got a big enough territory. And they need to remember.
Yeah, and you're also at least in the wild, you're exposing them to predators that unnecessarily. So I'll just build on what you were saying there about one portion of that. Anyway, they really do, all the amphibians and reptiles that we work with in the literature that I'm familiar with. They have very distinct areas that they go to breed, that they go to forage, and that they go to overwinter. And sometimes those can be very close together, but in other cases, they could be quite spatially distant. Those breeding, foraging, and overwintering habitats could be quite distant from one another. Here in our area, prairie rattlesnakes in Canada to the north of us are known to go 56 kilometers from an overwintering area out to a summer foraging area. They might breed right near and give birth to young right near the den site where they overwinter, but they can travel really significant distances to go to a foraging area, for instance. And so you can imagine how important that is relative to maybe a new road going in, or other habitat alterations when an animal travels that far.
Yeah, it's not why the deer crossed the road. It's why did the road cross the woods.
Yeah, exactly. Yep.
Yeah.
Yep.
And so you guys also do plants.
Yep, we do. We have a full-time senior zoologist. We have a full-time program botanist. And then we have assistant botanist and an assistant zoologist that support them. And then we have database management staff, four folks there. And then we have a web programmer that gets all that information up on our websites to make it available for everybody. And then those zoologists and botanists, they will sometimes hire summer field crews to help them do surveys for plants or animals. Yeah, and so, in Montana, we've got around 2,800 vascular plant species that our botanist is responsible for trying to document the status and distribution on, which is, a huge task all on its own. But then she also is responsible for the lichens and the fungi, non-lichenizing fungi, I should say, that occur in the state as well.
And I've been watching a guy from Georgia, and he does like prairie habitats for actual American wildlife, like actually botany and wildlife. And he talks about like actually the native plants being better covered for the actual native wildlife. They actually have more nutritional value than the stuff that invasive, and they have to do fires to actually work with that. And like I was talking earlier about this, the health department of my city wants to fine me when I don't mow my grass. And it was very interesting because like when he was talking about the prairies down there, he was talking about like the ticks, because it's more open land. They kind of dry up a little bit more, and ticks find it harder to actually be there. And so therefore it's actually better for everybody that you have some prairie and natural actual plants. And I was wondering what you guys do about that. What kind of natural plants? How can people help with that?
Yeah, well, I would just add to what you were saying there. A lot of human altered habitats are better habitats for invasive species. So when we alter those habitats, invasive species from Europe and Asia are more likely to move into those areas, and then that makes it difficult for species that are adapted to native vegetation for them to still exist in those areas. We do manage data on both native species and non-natives. And non-natives, I can kind of divide them down into invasives and those that are non-native but not necessarily all that problematic or non-invasive. And we try to manage several different data types for both native and non-native species. One is observation data. Where did someone see something on a particular date? How many of them were there? What was the population like at the time that they were recording it? So that observation data is one data type that we manage. We also manage survey location information. So anytime someone has gone and looked for a particular species using a particular protocol, or maybe a whole suite of species using a particular protocol, so we call those structured survey data. And then we will make what we call species of concern occurrences for our species of concern in the state, which are kind of local polygons where those populations occur. And that way that can be highlighted in any environmental review, permitting, or planning process to make sure that whatever is going on in that process can consider these native species of conservation concern in their planning efforts. We also develop range polygons that kind of outline the total extent of the distribution of a species. And then when we have enough observation data in place, we will make predicted habitat suitability models for individual species, and that predicts the quality of the habitat for those individual species. And so we're trying to make that available. We now have a little over 16,000 species in our database, and we're trying to develop all of those different data types for all of those species. And then we have an online field guide that people can look at information on the basic biology of species. And we're we're doing a relatively good job on that for our vertebrate species and our vascular plant species. And we're always trying to chip away at putting that same information in place for invertebrates and non-vascular plants like mosses and algae, as well as the fungi and lichens that I was talking about before. So, one thing that I was going to add to what you were saying before, Daniel, is I think you asked how could people, be involved with that. We are really making really good use of an app called iNaturalist.
I was about to say, I was about to ask.
Yeah, and it has been fantastic. And now I use iNaturalist a bunch myself, and I can't speak highly enough of it.
I've heard.
Yeah, I'll just say just a little bit about it. So it's an app you can have on your smartphone, and you can be out, and when you see something that you either know what it is or maybe you don't know what it is, and you want to document it, you can simply take a photo of it and then submit it, and then that'll go out to the iNaturalist community, and then you can put an identification on it if you know what it is, and then other people can agree with you or disagree. Or if you don't know what it is, but maybe like, hey, all I know is that this is a vascular plant, or all I know is that this is a grasshopper. And then that will allow other people out in the iNaturalist community to basically put an identification on there for you, so you can learn what it is that you saw. I just had a hiking trip over this last weekend where I don't know my mushrooms very well, but we had some recent rains here, and there were mushrooms out everywhere. And so I took photos of probably 15 different mushroom species, and I only knew a couple of them. But now other people are chiming in over time as to what species of mushrooms I saw. And then all of that data we can potentially make use of. And so we're keeping a list of experts for individual taxonomic groups. And so we have experts for mushrooms and experts for vascular plants and experts for amphibians and reptiles. And if they put an identification on it that says it's that species, we know we can trust that identification. And so we will then bring all that data into our database. And so far, I think we're a little over 60,000 observations in Montana for various species that we've been able to bring into our database and use and make available for natural resource managers to make decisions. And it's all based on people who care about what's around them. And it also trains you to be aware of what's around you, what species are around you. It's really a neat application.
A few thoughts that I have on iNatural. State of Utah makes it to where if you pull an animal out of the wild, you have to document it on their iNatural. So that's an actual program that I want other states to adopt, to be honest with you. Yeah. I'm absolutely 100% for it. My positive and negatives on iNatural is that it's really how you use it, because it would be easier for poachers to be able to use it to go out there and find stuff. But then that's actually makes it easier for people to protect it if it's done properly. So it's really one of those, if the state uses it properly, it's an actual truly positive thing. But yet, plus the lady from Utah said that one of the biggest problems that she saw was that once you clock that this area has this really cool species there, everybody goes there. Like it just gets overwhelmed.
Yeah.
And that's a problem in itself.
Yeah, it's definitely a balancing act on that front. One thing that iNaturalist does, they allow obscuring of locations. And so in some cases, we've lobbied the iNaturalist community to say, hey, we don't think there's any risk of people collecting this species. There's no risk of that location being kind of out in the open and people going and collecting it. People just don't collect that species. But for things like, say, orchids that might be collected, we've said, no, actually do obscure them. And that can be, some of those species are species of concern and others are not. And we might even say a species of concern that it should be not obscured because there's really no collecting pressure for that species that we know of. And then we could change that in the future if we become aware of collection pressures. So that's another thing that they've got built in. One other thing that I should have said earlier, they have this associated software package called Seek that is artificial intelligence that takes the image of the species that you're seeing, and it can kind of compare that to photographs of a bunch of identifications that it already has in place, and it can kind of preliminarily assign it to a species that way. So that can also help inform you what you're seeing just right at the time that you're there seeing the species and taking the photo. If you're connected to the internet, that is. You could do it later if you needed to, but.
So is there, like, the algae and stuff that you have there, is there types of plants that are really good for the wildlife that you know of? And how would people find that information? Is there a way to find that would actually be better for your state's wildlife to be planted?
Maybe I'm not understanding your question. Are you referring to it within iNaturalist or
just period?
Okay. So are you saying, are there species that we need more information on, or
anything? Like, the thing is that it would be nice if we as the public would be able to find the information on what plants we could plant, how to plant them properly. Do we need to burn the actual land to get the regular stuff to grow better?
Gotcha.
Where would that information be?
Yeah.
And what information can we learn that would actually help the local wildlife, like turtles and your foxes and whatever you've got there, your bats?
Yeah. What I would say on that front is, so for our program, we maintain the Montana Field Guide, which is at fieldguide.mt.gov. And people can go on to, again, fieldguide.mt.gov. And people can go on there and look up information on any of those 16,000 species I was talking about before. And they could, find out information on where is the species distributed, and we put that information out very generally. But also, what are the habitats that you find it in? There's a management section in there, and then above and beyond that, people can, access that information. But above and beyond that, we recommend that they get in touch with local natural resource managers, like the Montana Fish, Wildlife, and Parks local biologist there, maybe a Forest Service biologist, depending on if it's in the forested part of the state near forest land. But yeah, I think a combination of those is going to be the best route in terms of what people can do locally.
What are some of the biggest impacts that the Heritage Society has contributed? Positives and negative ones. Because there's lots of things where they've made mistakes. Florida Fish and Wildlife have accidentally killed a lot of the manatees by actually using herbicides to where they just killed off the plants, and now the manatees have been starving for a couple of years.
Yeah.
So
I would say that, so there are, just to step back a little bit, there are the equivalents of natural heritage programs in all 50 states and also all the Canadian provinces and or territories. And so in every case, they are there to have databases that centralize information on what species occur there, where are they distributed, and what is their conservation status. So all of those organizations are housed in different agencies, but that's their purpose, is just to kind of document things and their distribution and their status. And then we have a central body called NatureServe, that acts as kind of an umbrella parent body that brings all the data together. And they might, for instance, NatureServe might assign global conservation status ranks to a species, or they might model the predicted distribution of a species across its entire range rather than within a state or a province. And in terms of, so I would say the impacts of the heritage network across North America are huge in terms of letting land management and water management agencies know what species are there and what ones they need to be considering in any kind of environmental review, permitting, or planning process. They're really essential for making sure they're a voice. They act as a, kind of making sure that species and habitats have a voice in planning processes. So all good. I don't really see negatives in terms of negative impacts to, from heritage programs on species. We certainly do collect museum specimens to make sure that we're documenting the distribution of species and that is well documented in museums. That's a very valuable thing to have. Species documented with museum vouchers or herbarium vouchers. But beyond that, so that is certainly sacrificing, one or two local organisms for that documentation, but also really essential to making sure you really understand what you've got. There's a long history of organizations thinking that they have a certain species, and then they go back and start doing some testing, maybe genetic testing, and realizing, nope, we've got two different species here. And without those museum specimens in place, they can't do that. So,
I get that one. That's biologists got to name everything. So the taxonomy never stays, just never. It always changes.
Always moving forward. And I think things are settling down for some taxonomic groups on that front, and for others, there's still a long way to go to figure out all of the different taxa, especially. You can have organisms on the reptile front. This comes up a lot, where you might see old publications are showing that you have maybe 3 subspecies in a state. And then someone comes in maybe with a graduate study where they're doing genetic testing of those subspecies, and they'll find that what we previously thought are subspecies aren't, and that morphologically they might vary and they might look slightly different, but they're really essentially interbreeding, and there's that variation in those populations just naturally built in, and but they are interbreeding and they are the same species. And there's also times when they're cryptic species. So you have 2 organisms that really look the same to us when we're looking at them, but they are different species and they're not interbreeding. And so those genetic studies have been really informative on that front.
And important, yeah. So how does Heritage get funding?
So we have that can vary by different states and how those individual heritage programs, where they're housed and whatnot. In Montana, we have some core funding from the Montana State Legislature. And then we also partner with the BLM, the Forest Service, the Natural Resources Conservation Service, Bonneville Power Administration, the Nature Conservancy, some state agencies like Montana Department of Transportation, Department of Agriculture, Department of Natural Resources and Conservation. They also all provide funding. Montana Fish, Wildlife, and Parks, a very important collaborator. They also provide funding to help us, accomplish our mission. And so sometimes they're providing funding for databasing work, and sometimes they're providing funding to go do field surveys for different taxa. So we work with a lot of different organizations that have all kind of bought into that idea that it's better for everyone if we have this common central database And we're housed here in the Montana State Library, which is a really important place to be housed from the standpoint of it's a neutral, non-regulatory agency. We don't have a, quote, dog in the fight in terms of what management decisions are made. We just want to bring in the information and make it available to everyone. But it's a common source of information for everyone. And we feel like it's really valuable to our partners that we are not just unbiased, but we're perceived as unbiased, right? We don't have that dog in the management fight. We don't advocate for a particular outcome in environmental review or planning process. We're just here to provide that base information for everyone to make decisions.
Which was interesting because I wanted to ask that question if you guys were involved in the law making and stuff, and it's like, but that actually makes a lot of sense. You want regulatory agencies to be non-biased. Yeah.
And again, we're non-regulatory. We are a non-regulatory agency, but we're providing the information for regulatory agencies to use to make, whether it's rules or the legislature making laws. So we're going to provide that information for them to allow them to make informed decisions. And also, it's not just informed decisions, Daniel, but it's informed decisions that they can make quickly. Like, I'll give you an example. We recently had a train accident where several cars, a train bridge broke and several cars fell into the Yellowstone River. And we were able to basically just query our databases and provide that over to the resource managers within just a few minutes to tell them what species were going to be downstream of that train accident and what species might be, again, potentially impacted by I believe those cars were carrying tar and other petroleum products. So that's super important for agencies to be able to respond quickly in an informed manner. Another one that comes up fairly regularly here in Montana is responding to fires and bucketing water onto fires to control them. But we don't want an agency bucketing water from a pond where there's an invasive species and that they might be then spreading that invasive species across the landscape. So that information can quickly be accessed by fire crews to make sure they're not spreading invasive species around.
Yeah, that's massively important. I don't think the regular public understands that kind of stuff. The war in Ukraine, my first thought was the giant glass lizard. Friggin', that's part of Ukraine. I mean, they're going to be devastated. We really don't understand. I was listening to a podcast, Adam Conover, and he had a couple doctors on, and they were talking about the biggest thing that goes into your actual health is random. And it's just, the guy thought of it when he went to go get his wife, to watch his wife run a marathon from his hospital because he was a doctor, and he couldn't get into the hospital because of the marathon. So they actually looked it up and found that more people were dying the days of marathons. Just random. And so when you have a random accident, the more data you have, the better you're going to be. It's really one of those things, it's just wild to think that we don't have that control. And unless we're gaining that data, even when it's worthless at the time, it's never worthless. That's the whole point. It's like, it just may not be as important today as it is tomorrow, but it's always going to need to be there. And like we were talking about before, it's how you use it, not the iNatural stuff. What are some of the stuff that you guys do there that might be specialized? Yeah, I am so sorry about that.
No worries. You can hear me?
Yes.
Okay, cool.
Yeah. I don't know where it left off. But yeah, I was just wanting to. This thing has a deal where I have to end the recording while you're still here to make it finish. But
Gotcha.
other than that, I just wanted to know what you think other states might take away from your particular heritage.
Yeah. Well, again, I would emphasize that heritage programs across the United States and Canada are doing very similar things to what we're doing, and we do a lot of coordination across heritage programs, both within the United States and also in with the Canadian programs.
Well, let me. Where would they find their local their local heritage?
Basically, just Google for it. Yeah, Google for their local. Some of them in Canada, they're called conservation data centers. Many of them, not all of them. If I guess what I would say is they could query for whatever their state name is, and then Natural Heritage Program. They could also say their state name. This is in a Google search. They could say their state name and then say database on plant and animal, database on plants and animals in Missouri, something like that. I think that would probably do a good job of getting them to that local heritage equivalent. Again, they're not always called heritage programs. So, but yeah, I think beyond that, in terms of what your question was there, we are doing things very similarly, but I think what I would emphasize is that we've learned across that network of programs how important it is to have a solid observation database of really reliable records in place. And that means you got to have experts on plants, experts on the various animal taxa that can review those individual observations for their credibility and make sure that they're reliable for those natural resource managers or the general public to use. And again, that's sort of at the heart of what we do, is having that really reliable data in place. And then you can answer all kinds of questions off of that data in terms of what's the distribution of the species. You can make predicted habitat suitability models. You can determine what the status of a species is if you're tracking observations over time, and whether that status is changing or whether there's threats to that species, that kind of thing. So yeah, just good solid data that's really reliable and has experts looking at it to make sure it's of high quality.
Hey, thank you so much. I know you got to go pretty soon. Yeah. And I just want to say thank you for your time and your patience with me.
Yeah, no worries. Enjoyed the discussion, Daniel. You have a good day.